Excellent. All right, hello and welcome everyone to another PNP Live. My name is Bashan. I'm part of the event staff with Politics and Prose. Before we do get started with this event, I wanted to go over a couple of quick items. The first being that at any time, if you would like to purchase not only a copy of Ghostways, but also Underland, you'll be able to go to the chat section where you can find links taking you directly to Politics and Prose website, where you can purchase those books by Robert Macfarlane. Of course, we highly encourage that, and we thank all of you for your patronage. In addition to that, if any of you have any questions that you would like to ask of the author, we would ask that you place it separately in the Q&A box, just to help us separate and facilitate the question and answer period when we get there. That said, I have the pleasure of introducing Robert Macfarlane. Robert is a prize-winning author, and his best-selling books include Mountains of the Mind, The Old Ways, Landmarks, and with Jackie Morris, The Lost Words. He comes to us from Cambridge, England, where he's a fellow at the University of Cambridge, and he's staying up very late to make this event happen. Thank you. He will be joined in discussion by essayist Garnett Cardigan. And without any further ado, Robert and Garnett.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And we're going to keep Rob awake and take you through on a journey. We're going to especially spend time with his last, the three books that we're going to discuss in. Ghostways, which is a double book. It's a diptych of two books, two marvelous books, one Ness and the other Holloway. And along with that, Underland, which came out last year. Rob has been walking and making his way, as it were, from the ascent down below the surface of the earth. He began with Mountains of the Mind, climbing and making his way to peaks, then to the wild places in which he was going from place to place and reorganizing how we see maps and asking what kind of maps, what kind of stories are we telling ourselves through maps, and then making it all the way to where he is now, beneath the surfaces, to ask what kind of stories are landscape telling us? What kind of stories are we not seeing? How can walking be a way of moving into landscape, but also be a way of uncovering the kind of stories, the stories that are exploding all over landscape and that we too often miss or ignore or miss the rich resonances of. And so we're going to spend time with these three books, but not merely as a way to think about what they're saying, but also to ask, what does it mean for us all, especially now when so much is missing from us because we're drawn to domestic spaces. Too many of us were removed from public space. We're missing the joys and the beauties and the complications of encountering and intermingling with and learning from and seeing each other. What are we not seeing there? But even in what might be called normal circumstances, what do we miss? What don't we see? And I should start with Kay Miller, the poet and essayist and novelist Kay Miller, who in his long poem, The Cartographer Tries to Map a Way to Zion, sets the stage for much of what Rob has been doing and what we'll be doing tonight. And in it, Kay says, "The Rastaman thinks, draw me a map of what you see. Then I will draw a map of what you never see. And guess me, whose map will be bigger than whose? Guess me, whose map will tell a larger truth?" And Rob, a lot of your walking is about that, about trying to find new maps, or rather than finding new maps, looking at the maps that are right there spread out in front of us, whose truth we miss. So can you say something about the way in which you're in pursuit of these maps, the way in which you are pulling out these maps, excavating these maps in Underland and in Ness and in Holloway?
I will, Garnett. First of all, I'll just greet everyone from Cambridge, where it's 11 o'clock at night. I don't know where you all are. Give us a shout on the chat. Tell us where you're listening in from. I know Paul Holdengraber's here. Very happy to have him in the audience. I should then say that it makes me incredibly happy to spend this time with Garnett, who is a dear friend of mine and who is one of the most remarkable Walker writer, explorers, landscape listeners that it's my privilege to know. And we've walked together. We might touch on some of those walks in our conversation this evening, and I hope very much that in a future to come we will walk again together. So Garnett listens to place like no one else I know, and if he'll let me at some point, I'll read something he's written as well about this. Hello, lovely to see these names coming in and these places coming in. Kerry's there, Michelle's there. I should also explain perhaps why Garnett and I are both sitting in front of sort of vortex rabbit holes. It's absolutely right that Garnett, one of the most angelic presences I know, should have a halo glowing around his head. But these are the artworks of Stanley Donwood, who is probably well known to many of you as the artist of almost all Radiohead's album art and concert art. Who's also my collaborator in Ness, my co-creator in Ness, along with Dan Richards, my co-author in Holloway. He was also the co-creator, and Stanley has jacketed all my books. So it was Garnett's wonderful idea that we try out a Zoom background and that we have these two vortices, as it were, hovering there in acknowledgement of Stanley's part in the making of these books, and that incredible iconic image Never, which you see around Garnett, was the cover of Underland and has gone around the world really in the 25 or so languages that Underland has been published in. They've all had that incredible cover by Stanley. So welcome, and lovely to see these names coming in. Thank you so much, and for all the warmth. Mapping, yes. I mean, I grew up a Cartophile, and the maps that I fell in love first with were Ordnance Survey maps, because I was a climber and a walker. And Ordnance Survey maps, when you first fall headfirst into them, as it were, are cartographies of wonder. They carry history within them as well as space. They have particular fonts for different ages of entity. So they mark Bronze Age barrows and Neolithic burial sites, but they also show new forestry and roads and cities. Of course, it's a brilliant national mapping project, but of course it's also a military project. The Ordnance Survey was what spread out across the empire, and as it went, it erased and it overwrote. And one of the great examples of that is the way the Ordnance Survey overwrote the Gallic place names of the Outer Hebrides, for example, and the west of Ireland, as dramatized in Brian Friel's great play translations. And so what I didn't see when I was growing up was that the maps I was walking with and working with and dreaming with were also, of course, partial maps, and maps of silences and unheard voices and distorted place names. And gradually through the work of people like Rebecca Solnit, Garnett himself, many other brilliant writers on mapping and thinkers of mapping and place, I learned to become more interested in what might be called counter mapping, that practice whereby one walks up the voices that aren't registered, that aren't heard, and the way one tunes into sounds and traces and archives that are buried in place or present in place but not immediately registered in the usual archives. So that began the vast project of counter mapping landscapes, which began with Mountains of the Mind and is kind of ongoing infinitely, really, Garnett. Does that make sense?
Yes, but it seems to me that you're also thinking about memory as you're talking about, this counter mapping, because part of what counter mapping is looking at the so-called default memory, the standard memory, and saying what memories have been forgotten, what memories are left out, and then from Mountains of the Mind onwards, you've been chasing memory, the way in which landscape itself inherits memory, carries memory, hides memory, and also the kind of memories we carry in humans along with the landscapes, and how the pathways that we take are sometimes descents into memory, and those who go through them. And this is a line that I know you know from Emerson's journals, where he said, "The ground is all memoranda and signatures," and we're continually encountering this memorandum in these signatures. So
Yes.
I'd love to hear you talk about memory, especially with Holloway. Holloway in many ways is the scent. It's this feature made from centuries of pathways of bodies moving through of the earth's own natural processes of erosion and movement, carrying its memory, like particular rivers, that great inheritor of memories. And just how that descent into landscape, that pathway, actually opens up the invitation to observe, but also opens up the invitation to reflect on the kind of things that landscapes carry and that landscapes hide.
Yes, wonderfully phrased question, Garnett. And I know Holloway was written years ago now, and I now realise that it was effectively a threshold text that prepared the way for Underland. Prior to it, I'd written the old ways, which was really beginning to look at how landmarks are grooved and traced down into landscape, how landscape becomes a skin, a memorious substance, to use Tim Robinson's beautiful adjective. It is a substance that remembers. And then Holloway comes from the Anglo-Saxon, or the Old English rather, Holloway, hollow way. It's a path that is sunken significantly deep into the earth, not just a sort of lightly grooved desire line such as we might see in Central Park, which is itself a beautiful trace of intention and descent and city memory. But actually, in some places, Holloways are grooved 20 feet deep into the soft rock of greenstone, sandstone, particularly in the south of England, in Dorset. And these Holloways are beautifully co-authored. They're co-authored by elements, by rain, which is probably the predominant erosive agent. They're made by floral, natural, sort of vegetable action, ivy that clings and cracks the bedrock and wears away and weathers away. And they're made by human passage. They are desire lines. Typically, they run to the sea. They run sometimes between burial grounds. They are centuries old, well used paths, and wheels and feet have grooved them. So they are as sort of exemplary and enfolded a landmark as one could wish for thinking about how place holds memory. And the particular Holloways that give rise to the book Holloway that forms one half of the diptych in Ghostways has a really fascinating history of refuge and persecution. So it's a dark history folded into a natural history, as it were. This was during the Catholic recusancy, this was a Catholic valley in southern England, and it was where priests would effectively go fugitive and hold sort of wild masses in effect for the Catholics still left in the south of England at that time. So there's a history of persecution. There's still a Catholic chapel in that valley. Of people seeking others, whether for vengeance or for revelation. So it became a place to think with, we might say.
In that is this polyphony of so much going on. I mean, even around us is a particular visual polyphony, but there is also a polyphony of the landscape, that it's whispering wildness or sometimes shouting wildness, and there is wonder. But there is also, as you just said, there is, wickedness. There is, things to celebrate, things to lament. And I think of Lucille Clifton, and when my mind often goes to Lucille Clifton, and we've discussed her time and again. But that wonderful poem in her book Mercy, which says, "But whenever I begin, the trees wave their knotted branches, and why? is there under that poem always another poem? So Ness is, in many ways, demonstrating that polyphony. We have multiple voices coming in to talk about the ways that the landscape itself carries many voices, many memories. And it's a poem of sorts, but one in which it's searching for that poem that's always underneath that other poem. The way in which Lucille Clifton said that she'd walk past trees, and a tree wasn't never merely a tree. A tree, would carry the stories about the beauty of nature, but the tree could also carry the story of a lynching. Mm. And say something to us about Ness and your decision to invoke that polyphony with the multiple voices there, and what frequencies might we hear, or how do we begin to attune ourselves to these frequencies that are in the landscape in that polyphony?
Well, it's amazing to hear you read that Clifton, or speak that Clifton, those Clifton lines. The trees wave their knotted branches. I mean, that is what we are surrounded by in our backgrounds here, and that is the way Stanley himself wanted to artistically reckon with the layeredness of these landscapes. So these pencil sketches, some of them contain, the one behind me contains more than 10,000 individual pencil strokes, and each one had to be layered in the right sequence above the other. So these are complexly stratified images that we stand in front of, and Clifton's poem recognizes the complexity of those layerings in perception. Yes, no landscape speaks with a single voice, and anyone who seeks to make a landscape speak with a single voice is interested in power and is interested in erasure above all things. So it is, ever since reading Barry Lopez for the first time in the late 1990s, and realizing how generously he folded many voices and many forms and styles into Arctic Dreams, indeed into all of his work. I realized that no writer on landscape could seek to contain place within their own voice. They had to be porous. And Ness is probably the furthest outworking of that principle of porosity, polyphony, and assimilation. It's set on, if it has an Ur landscape in the same way that Holloway exists in Dorset, Ness exists on Orford Ness, this shingle spit off the East Anglian coast, not far from where I live, where Britain ran its sort of munitions and ballistics testing station site for 70 years, and that began with First World War munitions and ballistics testing, a secret site, a dark site as it were, and then ran all the way through to the atomic weapons research establishment, decades. And so we tested nuclear weapons out there, not obviously with the detonation of physics packages, but with stress tests for the casings and the detonators. So it was part of an archipelago of British nuclear geography that extended all the way to Woomera, to Maralinga, to places in Australia where the British forcibly cleared indigenous peoples and then have left long legacies of harm. So Orford Ness is a really dark landscape. It's also an astonishing one where nature has returned to these derelict buildings and structures which were once the venues for these testings. I can maybe give the best example of the polyphony just by reading one of the early pages, and this is the first page actually. So there are 5 forms coming, sort of concentrating on Ness at the beginning of the book, and they've come to contest the ritual of this figure called the armorer. So I'll just read the where you meet these first sort of these 5 figures. Look, 5 forms moving fast through the forests to Ness. Look, here it comes. Its bones are plastic. It builds itself from pallet slat and bottle top, rises from sift, is lashed and trussed with fishing line. It is drift. It has cuttlefish nails and sea poppy horns. It breathes in rain and it breathes out rust. Look, here he comes. His bones are willow, and he sings in birds. He rises in marsh, slips forwards by ripple and shiver. Between his tree ribs, birds flutter, then swoop ahead to settle, sing, quiver. His head is a raven's, his eyes are wren's nests. By day from his throat fly finch and firecrest, and in anger he speaks only in swifts. Look, here she comes. Her skin is lichen, and her flesh is moss, and her bones are fungi. She breathes in spores, and she moves by hyphae. She is a rock breaker, a tree speaker, a place shaper, a world maker. Look, here they come. Their eyes are hagstones, and their words are shingle. They rise on the shore, rock, cord, flint beings, scattering chert to signal their passage, sending stones through time to foretell their seeings. And look, here As comes, who exists only as likeness, moves as mist and also as metal, cannot be grasped or forced, is the strongest and strangest and youngest and oldest of all of the five, slipping through trees past houses, rolled by the wind at years each minute, rolled by the wind as if through time and in it. So those become the five forces and this pentangle of voices. So, Garnett, I want to turn the question back on you though, because I want to ask you about cities, because I've walked with you in cities, and it's astonishing. I mean, it is a little bit like walking with an angel, and I feel that I'm inside your force field, and it's partly the way that you meet people and you greet people. This characteristic that I think we both think of as openness, but in a very radical sense, I think you possess that quality. And I really want to ask you about listening to cities, not only cities, but and the people that are in them at that time, and also that have been there before. How are you open?
You began to answer it with a reading with an excerpt you read. Time and again you said, look, look, look. And part of what we do when we walk together, I do when I'm walking alone, is trying to look. What does it mean to see yourself in others? What does it mean to not see yourself in others? To recognize the world as something exploding with beauty and joy and frustration and complications and wondrous multitudinousness. What does it mean to encounter yourself sometimes in someone else's joke, or encounter another, and then be forced back into this new sense of possibility because of that encounter? And so when I'm walking, I'm often asking, what does it mean to meet myself in another? Or what does it mean to meet another and be drawn outside of myself? What does it mean to actually look, to be in the world and feeling it in all its richness and its kaleidoscopic wonder? But also the hauntings, as you were reading Ness and something that you explore quite a bit in Underland, and it's also there in Holloway, how so much of our walking is an act of excavation. That sometimes in our descent, we're descending in order to excavate memories, sometimes to excavate hauntings. And the hauntings often occur when our eyes are forced to huddle close to the mind's eye. That it's more than this evocative search, it's this real exploratory labor. And the hauntings occur when memory and sight draw close, and then begin to ask what might be there that we haven't seen. What might be the other maps, to invoke Kaimel again, what might be the maps that we've missed? And so when I'm walking, I'm often in search of possibilities, in search of stories, in search of ways of making memory and sight draw near, but recognizing they're both insufficient. And so what I often need is to find a way to expand my vista, as it were. And I think also of a way of walking to find out what our limits are, to bump against those limits, the limits of ourselves, the limits, that are there, and a way of questioning, ourselves, but often questioning society. So even walking in landscape, what we often think of, it's, the huge, open land, the open terrain in front of us. One of the things that you have written about time and again, and it's so much in Underland, in which you're literally going on the land, but you've insisted that there's a kind of claustrophobia that can happen in landscape. It's not merely the claustrophobia that we're confined in these domestic spaces, but a claustrophobia that comes in outdoors, in a sense that there's a crisis, or in a variety of crisis closing in on us. And so what is seen is, sometimes too quickly rushing to memory. And so in walking, it's a way of also slowing down, in a way of, pushing against the claustrophobia, of trying to push the borders, to open the borders, to recognize that we've put the fence or the gates too close to us, and that we need to expand it. And the only way to do that is by this continual loving, attentive listening and looking, by this constant encounter, and recognizing how much we're deeply bound, our fates are deeply bound with each other. And so it means being able to see ourselves in others, but also being able to have others bring us outside of ourselves.
Garnet, as ever, I wish that I just had an amanuensis, or that I was just writing down what you say, because it comes in fully formed paragraphs. I should say to people who are listening that Garnet was one of the first readers of Underland, and I thought I would. Kerry, excellent. Kerry has written it all down, Garnet. So that's another essay. Garnet was one of the first readers of Underland, and he read it with such kind attention, and he beautifully recognized that there was a book in there that was actually about community, profoundly about community, but that hadn't declared itself fully as such. And I thought I would just, sort of in honor of Garnet's reading of Underland, just read a section from very late in the book, which wouldn't exist without Garnet's attention to the draft of it. Late in the book, I visit a place called Onkalo, which means the hiding place in Finnish. And Onkalo is the only successful deep geological repository for the long-term disposal of high-level nuclear waste that, as a species, we have ever constructed. Many people listening will be conscious of the Yucca Mountain project, which has undergone so many kind of corruptions of many kinds and failures and has not been completed. Finland, little Finland, is the only country to have successfully dug a big hole in the ground that's stable enough to hold radioactive waste, the worst that we can make, for long enough that it will not toxify the surface or the depths until it's no longer a problem. And this, I went expecting that I would end up at the end of the world, as it were, sort of Gotterdammerung. But what I found there was the best example of human beings being good ancestors, to borrow Jonas Salk's unforgettable question. An immunologist who helped eliminate polio in large part, and whose work as an example is with us now as we race for vaccines. But he asked this extraordinary searching question: are we being good ancestors? And that is, in a way, the question of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, in its best form as a thought experiment, asks us to reflect on ourselves as not just trace-leaving species, but legacy-leaving species within deep time as it folds into the future. And at Onkalo, I found human beings organizing themselves into communities and polities with the ambition of being good ancestors. They wished to take responsibility for a legacy that would remain toxic for tens of thousands of years. And I was profoundly moved, and not least because one of them also stopped to help me change a flat tire on a dark road on a very, very cold winter night. Anyway, I just want to read a passage from the end of that chapter. And I'm down in the final storage area for the waste. It hasn't started to get filled up yet. It's 400 meters below the Gulf of Bothnia. Then I see that on another of the plastic panels bolted to the wall of the terminal chamber, there is a handprint in the dust, spread fingers, the pad of the thumb pressed clear. It's the print of a right hand, left there at some point, probably for the keeping of balance, or for the taking of rest, or just for the idle making of a mark. And I think of the black and red handprints left on the cave walls at Chauvet. Am I still with you? Sorry, Zoom told me I was being signed out, which was slightly concerning. I think of the red figures of the dancers with their outstretched arms, of the spray can hand stencil I'd seen on the catacomb wall in Paris, of Helen, my friend, reaching a hand down to haul me out of danger in the Moulin. I think of the many people I've encountered in and through the Underland, who have been committed to shared human work rather than retreat and isolation. Many of them have been mappers, really, mappers of networks of mutual relation, endeavoring to stitch their thinking into unfamiliar scales of time and space, seeking not the scattered jewels of personal epiphany, but rather to enlarge the possible means by which people might move and think together across landscapes, in responsible knowledge of deep past, deep future, and the inhuman earth. And that passage wouldn't exist without Garnett, who helped me see that the people I was most interested in were those stitching networks, maps of mutual relation across deeper time and space. So I thank you for that here, Garnett.
Oh, my joy, Rob. As you read it, I couldn't help but think about what it means to think about community, not only across space, but across time. In other words, one of the laments of walking landscape increasingly is the lament that we may not have a community that we can bequeath this to embrace it with stewardship. That that too often our thoughts go to the thing becoming the shadow too quickly. In other words, we sometimes feel that these walks are not so much in a memoranda in terms of chasing in the memoranda as much as we are creating in a last memories because of how much our environment is being despoiled. As you mentioned in Anthropocene, that what happens when you have the sense that the landscape is hurtling forward, moving too quickly, too swiftly, too ominously into memory, that what we're seeing before us threatens to become the past too quickly, or threatens to even move in a past, being the past. And so our steps are being pulled to hauntings far too quickly. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and it hovers over Underland. Hovers, may not even hovers, it's a central part of Underland, but it's also hovering over Ness and on Holloway. What happens when our steps have the faint echo of last steps?
Well, that's another beautifully phrased question, Garnett, and I may answer it yet again by referring to the image that hovers behind you, because as you will know if you've read to the very end of the acknowledgement section in Underland, what looks like a glowing sun rising at the end of a Holloway, in Stanley's painting of it, is in fact a nuclear explosion. So as he points out, the viewer who looks at Nether is seeing the last thing they will ever see before the flesh is melted from their bones. But don't worry, it's fine. You're safe, Garnett. But so that image which is on the cover of Underland, as I say, is exactly what you describe, is the shadow of annihilation, to borrow Zebart's phrase, which he in turn takes from that other great kind of ruminator on transience, Sir Thomas Browne, in Religio Medici and Urn Burial. And we have a modern name for this. It's given by Glenn Albrecht, and the term is solastalgia. Solastalgia is the pain that comes from, not from moving away from a known landscape and then looking back at it from a distance, but from but from staying in one place and seeing the landscape transformed around one so rapidly that it becomes unrecognizable. Solastalgia is S-O-L, sorry, there's a question in the chat from Kim Marie, who I'm extremely glad to see here. Hey, Kim Marie. Solastalgia is S-O-L-A-S-T-A-L-G-I-A. So a play on nostalgia, but solastalgia. Albrecht coins it in 2003. He's doing work with communities in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales in Australia. And he's interested in how climate change is shifting the landscapes around these people so rapidly, and how big corporate mining is doing the same, that they are not moving anywhere, but their home landscapes are becoming unrecognizable. And he recognizes that there is a pain for the psychic distress that these people are feeling while staying in one place, which has no name, no given name. So he coins solastalgia, and as many people listening will know, that's become an influential and sort of almost a meme, really, of the Anthropocene. And I think it's a very powerful word. It convenes and assembles a great number of feelings, which range from the inhabitants of Sheffield who saw the county council in league with a multinational contractor chop down around 6,000 trees within the city's limits because of effectively a road contract, a city becoming unrecognizable around its inhabitants in too short a time. So this is profoundly interesting to me, and I think you're right. It is an affect of the age, but it's not exclusive to the age. John Clare, the great so-called peasant poet of 19th century Britain, the enclosures did almost exactly the same to his landscape in Northamptonshire. That landscape became hedged, owned, access constrained, and in the first half of his lifetime it became unrecognizable. So Underland and Yes Ness track solastalgia, but they also pledge fealty to forms of landscape that are more durable, and here I think deep time enters the conversation as a sort of geological conscience, if you like.
As you mentioned, conscience and time and landscape, in the midst of all of that is recognizing multiple voices. The landscape is recognizing multiple voices, but also the landscape as recognizing multiple silences. And so our walking, our explorations, our encounters, our journeys, our routes to multiple voices, yes, but multiple silences also. And how then do we begin to hold all of those in proper balance, in honorable balance? And John Mayer's famous remark that he went out in order to go in, has often been the mantra of many walkers. But it's clear that for you, and I know it's the same for me, that part of going out is to go out. We're going out not merely to listen to ourselves, but to listen to others, but also to actually listen to the land and to say, what are the voices that are there that are not being listened to, but also what are the silences, and how important is that to give us not merely a sense of space, but also a sense of time, a reminder that we're in land that has been occupied by many before us, in a land that people have been eliminated from, forced from, unjustly forgotten. And so part of the task is to not only listen across space, but to listen through time, to give proper honor and homage and respect to those who have gone before, or who are still here, but their imprint has not been acknowledged.
Yes, it's a beautiful, a wonderful phrase, Garnet. Well, all of them were, but honourable balance, I think, is it makes me think of the work of Tim Robinson, who I've mentioned already, and who's a question about whom has already come up in the chat. Tim, if you don't know Tim Robinson's work, please read Setting Foot on the Shores of Connemara, or read the first of his great Arran Diptych, Pilgrimage, which is both of which, well, the Aaron books published by the New York Review of Books Classics. Tim died this year of COVID, with COVID, and it was a desperate loss. He was a inspirational figure to me, as to so many people, and I think will probably emerge over time as one of the absolute giants of place writing in Anglophone literature. And he was a sort of Ruskin and Proust of the west of Ireland, but like all great writers of landscape, he was interested in so much more than, while remaining honorably attentive to, a very specific terrain. And I think of him because his project was one of honorable balance. It was of restorative attention, we might say. So we loop back around to the idea of the Ordnance Survey, which did so much overwriting and distorting in the west of Ireland in the second half of the 19th century. And Tim was determined to teach himself cartography. He became a brilliant surveyor and maker of maps, an artist, a visual map maker, but he also recognized the need for deep mapping. And that is where prose and writing comes in, which can admit so many voices. And I in the impossible world that can never be, Garnett, I would love to have gone on a walk with you, with Tim Robinson, with Nan Shepherd, up into the hills, or seen them follow you through New York. And I think you've given us this beautiful answer. I hope people won't mind if I read something that Garnett has written. It's in his voice, but I'll is it all right if I speak this, Garnett? It's just from your...
Yes.
Yeah, okay. It's from this wonderful counter mapping project that Garnett did with Joshua Jelly Shapiro and Rebecca Solnit, Nonstop Metropolis, a New York City Atlas. And then, I don't know, we could go to questions when I've finished. Okay, so this is Garnett, I think, giving a wonderful answer to this question of silence and voice. We carry within us the maps of our wanderings. We inscribe upon our imaginations the routes we have known, and we impose them on new journeys, one map layered on another. So I try to walk against the maps soldered onto my mind, hoping to create fresh, unencumbered ones. As I move around, though, I never forget that the unremarkable yet remarkable fact that because I am Black and an immigrant, there are many regions I have to navigate with caution, others that are out of bounds to me. Our maps are our stories, and we leave ourselves open to new stories, new possibilities, new visions of ourselves and the world if we walk to get lost, to admit our ignorance and finitude by encountering the new and the different. Something inside of me wants to master this unconquerable metropolis that is New York, but the city is unstoppable, moving on unsentimentally and making my attempts to know it hardly more definitive than snapshots across time. Each pass I make through the city uncovers more of its texture, but also reminds me that much is hidden. I'm not seeing the tip of the iceberg, I'm seeing the tip of a wing of a bird on the iceberg. This inexhaustible city need not exhaust us. We can walk into wonder. So good, Garnett. Just brilliant. I remember writing to you when I first read the line about the tip of the wing of the bird on the iceberg. Just fantastic.
Thanks, Rob. Too kind of you. And we have a question from Marsha Cam, which you've begun to answer, but I'd love for you to dive into more. Marsha says, I find that as I'm isolated in the Midwest, where I grew up in Nebraska during the COVID, instead of the San Francisco Bay where I lived for 30 years, I don't have access to all the places that live in my heart as my wild places. So I go to the several prairies that are close to me, and because they're smaller and less wild, that I've started to circle in closer and closer and closer to see the flowers close-ups and follow the seasons of the plants and the landscapes of the seed pods seeds arrive. So I have another map to explore. And so I'd love your reflection on that, because it also speaks to someone who's dear to you, who hovers over Holloway, Roger Deakin. And part of what Deakin was concerned about was the way in which we can make each landscape something that we draw close, and to see the multi layers and beauties in it, the way Marcia is doing where she is right now.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous paragraph you've written there, Marcia. It stands in its own right as its own best answer, really. I will take up Garnett's kind invitation to reflect on Roger, and there's a phrase which I use of Roger Deakin. If you haven't read him, Marcia and others, Wildwood, Notes from Walnut Tree Farm, and I'm very happy to say that Waterlog, his inspirational account of swimming through Britain, is finally going to be published in America next year by Tin House Editions. So Roger, I described him as an explorer of the undiscovered country of the nearby, and it seems to me that's what you're doing, Marcia. You're exploring the undiscovered country of the nearby. That the constraint of COVID has become a revelatory one in this instance, even as it causes such harm and exerts such cost in so many others. I don't think the phrase that I used then of Roger is mine, and rather wonderfully, I thought it was Robert Penn Warren's, but it doesn't turn out to be his, and I've never been able to find who said it, but it sort of entered my personal lexicon of phraseology for Roger, and that's what he was. He and my children taught me to lower my sight lines and to cinch down my circumferences and to tighten my roaming radius and to see that wonder was there in the field path. And there's another line from Patrick Kavanagh, the great Irish poet of the famine, among other things. He says to fully know the junction of 4 fields or a hole in the hedge is a lifetime's experience. And I love the humility of this idea that scale really at its upper reaches is a grandiloquence. The romantic sublime is a glorious thing, but it can be dispensed with. And Roger taught me to focus and to look down, to change my posture of attention to the world. So thank you for letting me think that aloud with that gorgeous question of yours.
And that's a partial answer to Jeffrey Kenton's question, because Jeffrey asks, I've just read Jenny Reddy's Wonderland, and I'm wondering who else you might recommend I read who disrupts the dominant narratives about walking in the landscape.
Oh, well, Garnett will have many suggestions himself, but I mean,
our beloved Rebecca Solnit.
I was going to say the first name on my lips is Rebecca, whose whole project has been one of counter mapping in prose, in cartography, in politics, in essays. So powerfully and influentially committed to retrieving those voices. I think of, as so often, of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's Gathering Moss is another work of close attention at what's sometimes called the boundary layer, the almost hard to see interstitial space in which mosses, lichens, and liverworts and other bryophytes flourish, but that sometimes gets forgotten in our haste to rush for the canopy or the skies or the stars. Garnett, you throw in a few names for us as well.
Camille Dungy, who I think is a wonderful walker and noticer. I mean, the great walkers are the great noticers and great listeners, and Camille Dungy is just absolutely marvelous, and I wish more people would include her, not only poetry but also in prose. In the annals of walking.
The essay that begins Camille's Black Nature anthology, which I taught the essay as well as the poems of that anthology to my students 3 weeks ago. It's a glorious piece of very, very subtle. Just begins with her. I think it says the first tree I ever thought to learn the story of. And then it goes on about a tree in Lynchburg, Virginia, and it just unfolds from that wonderful idea that this was the first tree she ever thought to learn the story of.
Yeah. And Robin, Robin Wall. I mean, it's, she's just absolutely marvelous. And I know that, you've been in conversation with her also.
Yeah. Just again, someone one day I really hope we might get to walk together.
Yes. And Nan Shepherd,
Yes.
to invoke. And some of these are also partially answering in a question that Alice Harrison had asked, who sometimes feel defeated by the mountain, but shouldn't be, because Alice asks, Alice is in Cambridge, so I'm not sure if it's Cambridge, England, or Cambridge, Massachusetts. I have a feeling it's Cambridge, England.
I think it might be.
But she says Mountains of the Mind was very thought-provoking for her and challenging. So thank you. That's her thanking you. I have a lot of questions, but only 2 tonight. So I'm trying to write about my own experiences in nature and about a particular mountain I love. We all have that mountain, Alice. But I always feel I'm not good enough. Have you ever felt like this when you started writing about nature? And do you have any advice? I find it so hard not to give my personal view on nature. But we love your personal view, Alice.
Yeah. You mustn't feel constrained from giving that at all. I take it this is, so those who don't know Cambridge, England, should know that the dizzying heights of the alpine reaches of Cambridgeshire are about a mile from my house, and there are a couple of chalk downs that rise to 76 meters above sea level, and that's about as bumpy as it gets in Cambridgeshire. So yeah, not many mountains around here. I think you should write about what you love. I think you should write about that mountain. When people ask me how to begin writing, I always say, write about what obsesses you, because that will twist the language you use. The strength of your obsession with it will twist the language you use, and twisty language is going to be interesting language. So why do you love that mountain? What is it about it that makes you fall in love with something that will not love you back? Something that is only rock and ice, or rock and matter. And just try to explain that puzzle, because that's a mystery right there. And if you can unfold that, you'll have written something that will be utterly yours and strange.
There's a question. Oh, England. So good night, Alice. She's keeping late hours with you, Rob. So here's a question, and it has popped up multiple times in the Q&A, but also in the comments section. Sebald, a variety of people, asking the role, influence of Sebald, and just Sebald's influence on your work. So Barton Verrett has asked, and a few others have also asked.
Yes, like many people, I fell under Sebald's spell very powerfully. Perhaps we might say sort of was consumed by his shadow, or stepped into his shadow in that period in the, I sound old when I say this, but that period early in the 3rd millennium, when anyone who was writing itinerant non-fiction ended up sounding a little bit like Sebald for a while. And the extent of my obsession with his work went so far that I was going to write a divagatory biography of Sebald. So I was going to walk the four great walks in his books. The most famous and proximate to me of those being the walk down the Suffolk coast that occupies the rings of Saturn, and is the pilgrimage, the Wallfahrt, that gives it its German subtitle, Die Ringe des Saturn, ein englische Wallfahrt, an English pilgrimage. And each of the other books, Austerlitz has a great London walk, really. The Emigrants has a walk down off the moors of Manchester, and Vertigo has a walk really through Allgäu, Sebald's native landscape, where in fact there is now a marked Sebald trail. I'm glad to say I gave up on this idea and realized that to give myself over to it fully would be to be consumed utterly by Sebald, and only really to offer a wan shadow of what he'd achieved, and there were so many reasons why that wouldn't be a useful thing to contribute. So in a sense, I came into such a collision course with Sebald's force that I spun off, fortunately, in another direction, and recognized that I needed to make something new. But the traces of Sebald are still present, certainly. But he wasn't a very good natural historian. Neither am I, but I'm interested by his partiality. But I learned a huge amount about pattern, and I think I'm still more interested in pattern than I am in plot, and that's probably Sebald's influence. But yes, and in rhythm, the rhythm of prose. Garnett is a master of this, but I think anyone who walks, which is one of our three great rhythmic activities as a species, breath, heartbeat, and footfall being those three, needs to think of their rhythm as they write, even if they're writing prose. So I learnt that from Sebald too, just putting an ear to those great anchor chain sentences of his in German.
Tie two questions together.
Sorry, Garnett, I missed the first part of that.
I'm going to pair two questions. Or I'm going to pair questions. Stephen Sparks asks, a question for both of you. Maps can lead us, but can also lead us astray. I wonder if you might speak a little bit to some of the ambiguities and possible waywardness, I love that word, of mapping. And the second question is from Paul Holden-Graber. So the question Robert and Garnett might enjoy is a comment on Walter Benjamin's opening line of Berlin Childhood, book we both know and love. And this is the opening. Not to find one's way in a city, maybe uninteresting and banal, but to lose oneself in a city, as one loses oneself in a forest, that calls for quite a different schooling. To lose oneself as an art, I'd love to hear you riff on this, digression and divagation. And I think that and Stephen, there's a lot of overlap on map, leading us astray, and map leading us. And so, getting lost, and the ambiguities and possible waywardness of mapping.
Well, the prose that accompanies the jacket of Holloway in its first edition, the last line is a map of the Holloway is not contained within this book. So it specifically rejects the idea that this is itself a prose map that must be followed, and it prefers to urge the reader into a serendipitous mispursuit of whatever clues are present, and indeed many hundreds of people have now followed the clues in Holloway and sought to locate what they take to be the Holloway that we write about and that Stanley draws, and we regularly get letters and photographs on social media. Is this it? Is this it? And my response is always, a map of the Holloway's finding is not contained within it. So, and then at risk of cliche, in response to Paul's wonderful quoting of Benjamin, the art of losing is increasingly hard to master, and I think we all know the ways in which we are collared, cuffed, and coordinated by handheld GPS devices now. And I've recently finished a long essay for the New York Review of Books on the virtues of lostness, and particularly the neurological consequences of devolving our navigational and wayfaring powers and techniques and skills to outsource to an instrument. So there's a 5,000 word answer coming your way, Paul Holden-Graber. Garnett, you're the master of the digressive walk. Tell us what you think here.
Well, getting lost and mapping, dealing with the waywardness of mapping is about narrative. That's one of the beauties about working on that book with Rebecca, in which she continually reminded me. She did it first in Wanderlust, but in Nonstop Metropolis, which had completed a trilogy, Infinite City and Unfathomable City, that mapping really is an invitation to question our narratives, to ask, not merely where are we in the world, but who are we in the world? How do we see others? What stories about ourselves, in our places, in people that we clutch to with zeal and are unwilling to let go, and unwilling to put ourselves in places where we can let them go, because we then expose ourselves to another narrative. And so to think about the waywardness of mapping is, also to think about the ambiguities and waywardness of narrative. How do we put ourselves in places in which our narratives will get challenged, in which our narratives will get buffeted and shifted and changed? It reminds me of this joke. I'll give it a clean version. It was a meme in which it said, New York City, and there's a map of the grid right beneath in New York City, and it says, because we want you to get where you're going. And then right beside it says Boston, and you saw all the serpentine highways and interspersing and intermingling, and it says, because forget you. It's a much stronger word than forget, but it was that New Yorker's version of Boston, of the experience of Boston. And what it was two different maps bumping against each other, the inability to adjust and stretch and genuflect the grid to the new realities, to the new place and people that you were around. And what it meant that you had a map sorted on that you need to unsolder. And so to deal with the ambiguities of mapping, to think about getting lost, is to ask, how do I put myself in places, in circumstances, around people, who I'd not normally see. I'm going to misquote it, but in his novel Augustown, Kai Miller had this remarkable line where he said, he said, and I'm misremembering, but I'll post an accurate one before we close. But he said, the more urgent question is not, if you're believing this story, the more urgent question is like, are these the kind of people you have never taken the time to believe in? And so to open yourself to that rich possibility of waywardness, to ambiguity, which is a good place to be. It means that you're beginning to question narratives and opening yourself to other narratives, but sometimes also to challenge narratives. To properly digress, to lose yourself, means to also wander to places, deliberately walk into places at times, where people who you would not have normally taken the time to believe in. And also to flip it, sometimes that you're the person that people would not normally take the time to believe in. And so you're going to actually also, walk into spaces and invite your narrative into these spaces, where it was formerly excluded.
Kerry, I hope you wrote all that down as well, because that's another chapter of the book, Garnet. People have been very generous with their attention. We should probably wrap up before I have to stick the matchsticks in between my eyelids.
Well, I'll wrap up with one last one, and with apologies to Tiffany Nichols, who asked a lovely question about the process of writing dark matter, and how you weave together dark matter research, mining, history of the land, and your experience of the site, and wanted to figure out that. Well, actually, I'll give it a choice. Either that question, or the question, has walking taken on a different meaning for you during the pandemic, when so many have discovered it? So that question, or Tiffany Nichols's question, both lovely questions.
Lovely questions. I'll do them both really, really quickly, actually, if I may. It goes back to Marsha's idea. I just ran the same route day after day. Running kept me sane, kept me straight through the hardest of the months, and I learned so much. I wore a path with my feet, and I learned so much running the same route over and over and over again and watching it change. So I think it reminded me of how little I know even of the landscape I've lived in for longest. So that did change. And Tiffany's question about dark matter, well, thank you. I'm glad that somebody who is who is writing about physics and is doubtless much more fluent in it than I am, approved of that chapter. That means a lot. And the answer is, it really hurt my head. I really had to think very, very hard about dark matter from a lay perspective, to be able then to re-explain it back. But what really made that chapter was meeting this young dark matter physicist down there, and we had very little time, and I asked him about 7 really odd questions, and he gave the most extraordinary answers to them. And that's the conversation that ends that chapter about what it's like to know that you live in a universe where trillions of dark matter particles and neutrinos are passing through you as though you are a gossamer sieve. And his answer was one about love, and I still am moved by it when I remember it. So that seems a good note to end on.
Certainly is. I was looking with a heavy heart for all the questions we can't answer, but some of them are already anticipated and answered in Rob's 3 absolutely marvelous, lovely books. The diptych, here in Ghostways, Ness and Holloway, and in which he shows Holloway is also hollowed ground in a place bursting with mysteries and rumblings and beauties, but also silences, that deserve to be listened to just as much as the voices. And Underland, that deep time journey, which is this rich journey across space, but also across time, and inviting multiple voices to take that journey alongside him as he listens to them. So I hope that you'll buy them if you haven't had them. Also, grandma, grandpa, uncle, auntie, nephew, are all waiting for you to get it for them. And Politics and Prose has put multiple hints. And so I'm actually going past it and saying, please support your local, wonderful, independent bookstore who've made this forum for us all to have this lovely conversation. So thank you all for coming. Please stop by, and don't merely get in these books of Rob's. Take some time, linger around, get a few more other things on Politics and Prose. It's the end of the year. People need, the joy of the written word. They need the company of other voices. They need the company of people across space and time. And you're going to be the one to give it to them. But thank you for your lovely questions, for the lovely conversations, for the great recommendations in the chat section. I hope somebody's saving that. And thank you, Rebecca, for the me and Rob.
Well, thank you very much, both Robert and Garnett. There's not really anything I need to say now. However, I do want to ask you both one last question, even though we're a little bit over time. If there's anything that you're currently reading, and if so, could you just please quickly share that with our audience?
You first, Rob.
Okay, 2. One, I just can't say enough about this invisible book, which you can't see. So I'll tell you that I've mentioned it before, but it's Joy Harjo's great new Norton anthology of Native Nations poetry. When the light of the world was subdued, our songs came through. And I'm also reading James Salter's The Hunters, which is about his novel about his time as a jet fighter pilot in the Korean War.
Sometimes the book pulls you in with such grace and generosity and warmth and wisdom and wit that you finish and your only choice is to reread it. And in this case, I'm on a reread of Sarah Hendren's absolutely gorgeous and lovely and generous, a book that's written with such grace and in a so humane. It's called What Can a Body Do? It's a book I recommend to anybody who has a body. You have to read this. It's a book about in the imagination. What does it mean to imagine other people in the world? What does it mean to see yourself as accommodating others? What does it mean to actually truly see others, and what kind of demands that make on us? But she writes it with such charm and such grace and such incredible generosity that it's the kind of book that you put it down and begin to see yourself, and you begin to see the world, and everything from the built in a world and the designs are in a mere chair doesn't become a chair for you anymore, but you also begin to see, your call and your responsibilities to other people, and what it means to actually be, richly human, to see people and to respond to them in full kaleidoscopic humanity. It's just a marvelous book written with such beauty and grace. And I insist, I'm not even encouraging, I insist that everybody don't walk, run, and rush and grab it. But it's in a Sarah Hendren, Hendren, What Can a Body Do?
Thank you very much. I'll have to let you know if I have anything you need to plug, Garnett.
It's just an absolutely lovely book.
Absolutely. Once again, thank you very much, Garnett and Robert. And of course, thank you everyone who's tuned in to another PNP Live. Everybody stay safe and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gun.